Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion with Dr. Aboubakar Sanogo as part of the ICO Cinema of Ideas program. My name is Xavier Alexander Pillai, and I'm the curator behind the season. The following discussion with Dr. Sanogo will address his work and the implications of his work regarding returning/restituting cultural heritage to audiences. The program has been informed by thoughts I had around restitution, mainly questions I wanted to answer regarding the process and history. It developed from moving initially to thinking about stories I had read and researched, and sort of the podcasts and discussions that I'd heard on this topic. Further, working with the ICO, Annabelle Aventurin and Dr. Lena Mahishi has been really helpful in sort of developing some of these thoughts, and very fortunate that my contributors have endeavored to discuss their experiences in this work and in the field. The program is and remains free for its duration, but we ask that you consider donating to the Cine Archives of Paris through the donation page to return sound to Balado Source. Now to introduce our special guest to this discussion, I'd like to welcome Dr. Aboubakar Sanogo. Dr. Sanogo is an associate professor in film studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. He's currently writing on the history of documentary film in Africa and on the cinema of Med Hondo. He was instrumental in establishing the African Film Heritage Project, a partnership among the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, FEPACI, the Film Foundation World Cinema Project, UNESCO, and the Cineteca di Bologna to preserve and restore African films of historical, cultural, and artistic significance. So you have just returned from FESPACO. I wanted to start by playing the short clip that recently surfaced on Twitter featuring the Tunisian filmmaker Farid Bouguidia, where he talks about his experience of watching the first film made in Burkina Faso with audiences at FESPACO.
Moi, le souvenir le plus extraordinaire de ce deuxième FESPACO en 73, parce que j'ai assisté, ça je ne l'oublierai jamais, et ça a justifié pour moi non seulement le FESPACO lui-même, mais la FEPACI et tout ce rêve qui continue de faire un cinéma africain viable sur son propre territoire et pas seulement limité aux festivals étrangers ou à être une vitrine un peu de l'Afrique, c'est quand j'ai eu la chance d'assister à la toute première projection du premier long métrage burkinabé, donc voltaïque de l'époque, qui s'appelait Le sang des parias. À l'époque, il n'y avait que 2 salles de cinéma qui étaient réservées au festival, qui étaient le Rialé et l'Oubri, 2 salles en plein air, donc sans plafond. Et c'était assez extraordinaire, parce qu'on devait attendre que la nuit tombe pour pouvoir aller voir les films. Donc dans la journée, c'était formidable, puisqu'on ne pouvait pas voir des films, alors on allait soit en excursion, visiter le pays. Ce jour-là, c'était une journée extraordinaire, parce qu'on était dans la salle, on a attendu vraiment qu'il fasse sombre, que la nuit tombe, et sur l'écran, on commençait les premières images du premier long métrage burkinabé, qui était, voltaïque de l'époque encore, qui était Le sang des parias de Mamadou Djimkola. Et de ma vie, je n'ai vécu cette expérience de voir le bonheur, la joie, la ferveur de gens voyant enfin sur l'écran leur propre langue, le moré. Et de voir enfin des personnages qui étaient eux, non pas dans un court-métrage didactique sur la santé, mais dans un film de fiction. Et ça, le sentiment de fierté nationale qui était celui de tous ces gens et de moi-même, tunisien, assistant à cela et vibrant avec ce peuple, entendant sa langue et voyant ces personnages, c'est une chose que je ne peux jamais oublier. Et je suis tellement fier d'avoir assisté à ça, comment le cinéma africain restitue à un peuple son miroir, sa langue, son identité, par le simple fait d'un film de fiction. Et ce jour-là, le miracle était achevé et le FESPACO, pour moi, pouvait vraiment démarrer. Il avait sa raison d'être.
So you've just returned from the festival. So I was wondering if you could discuss your highlights from the 2023 edition and maybe provide the audience with a primer about the importance of the festival in the region.
Well, first of all, I'd like to respond to Farid, of course. What he said about his experience in 1973 still remained the case in 2023, that is 50 years later. At this FESPACO, for example, there was a Burkinabe film by a filmmaker called Apolline Traoré. She's one of the major filmmakers in Burkina these days. The title of the film was Sira. Burkina was hoping, because has been hoping to get the Yenanga stallion for 3 decades now. Because in the 90s, he got 2 with Idrissa Ouedraogo and Gaston Cabourin, and nothing since. And so they were really pinning a lot of hope on Napoleon Traoré to win this year's award. And you should have seen the two screenings of Sira, which was the title of a film. I had never seen, certainly I had not in recent memory seen that many people trying to get into the movie theater, either at Cine Burkina or Cine Nerwai. So festival participants, Burkinabe spectators and audiences were just pushing, shoving each other, trying to find a way to make it in. It's clear that in Napoleon, they saw the potential for, of course, a voice, a cinematic voice of the country to really, again, regain this famous and much coveted award called the Yananga, the Golden Yananga Stallion, but also just an embrace of the national cinema, right? The national cinema that could speak both to them and to the world in a meaningful way. And that fervor that Farid is mentioning was still very palpable, to the extent that many of the festival guests decided that the Burkina audience loved this film so much that they would rather, as festival participants coming from abroad, just leave the line and let the Burkina audience enjoy the film. So it's still something that's still operated. But more broadly speaking, to answer your question, FESPACO obviously is a wonderful experience. It's a one in a lifetime experience. I like to say to people when I describe FESPACO, that one has, if you're a Muslim, you have to go to Mecca once in your lifetime. If you're a cinephile, you have to go to FESPACO once in a lifetime. It's that significant. It's, of course, for me, important for multiple reasons. I was born in Burkina, so to go to FESPACO is to go home and see my family, my city of birth, etc. But of course, it's a pilgrimage to my own cinephilic origins. It was at FESPACO that I developed a love for cinema, for African cinema, that I had a chance and the fortune and honor and privilege to meet many of the founding figures of African cinema. I think of Sembène, Yakane, Tahar Sheria, Paulin Vieira, Timothy Bazori, Mustafa, all these people, Safi Fai, Sarah Maldoro, all these people came to FESPACO. It was their festival. They had created this festival to be a space where the work could be featured, because they were banned, quote unquote, from the movie theater that existed in their own country. The commercial theaters felt that they could recoup their money showing Hollywood and other kinds of films, so why bother showing African film? And so FESPACO for them, right from the start, was really a liberated zone, very literally, because the screens were occupied. To a large extent, the screens are still occupied in many ways. And so the vitality, the vital significance of FESPACO still remains as ever today. Now, FESPACO 2023, of course, meant, of course, watching new films, seeing, of course, the future of African cinema through the eyes of new filmmakers, because you can see the ambition, the desire to do something that matters. Because African cinema, as I mentioned in my opening because we did celebrate the centenary of Sembène, I mentioned that, one of the key elements of the heritage of somebody like Sembène was to establish once and for all, and of course forever, perhaps, the law according to which African film practice shall be at once aesthetic and political. Right? That law, so to speak, still remains a defining feature of many African film works, many of the debates around African cinema, and so on and so forth, and it remains. So to see these young filmmakers trying to invent cinema in their own image, of course, to be involved in debates around African cinema, because of course, going to FESPACO is not only to go watch films, it's infinitely more than that. I mean, it's not, honestly, it's not like, going to Western film festivals, like you're in line, you go watch the film, you go home. I mean, FESPACO is I don't even know what to call it. It's a total experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bodily experience. It's a sensual experience. It's a epistemological experience. It's a cinephilic experience. It's an
One of the
experience of bonding. It's all that together.
So one of the cornerstones of I guess the ecosystem of film on the continent.
Yes,
I,
no doubt.
I guess sort of speaking to that, I know Burkina Faso is one of sort of 8 countries on the continent that maintains a film institution that works on the preservation of cinematographic heritage.
That's right.
Is one of the 8 countries that has a film institution that works on sort of major preservation of film and celluloid.
Okay.
When we sort of, I guess, talk about the conditions for archives on the continent, I sort of think back to the 2021 fire at the campus on the University of Cape Town, which was sort of a gravely serious incident. I know there's sort of ongoing work to determine how much of the collection can be salvaged from the fire, but has FEPACI been involved in this process at all?
Not formally, but in various, through my own involvement, if you will, for example, because one of the elements of my work around the archive, of course, within FEPACI, but also within the university and the academic system. And so that involved what I call a kind of scholarly infrastructure that we try to create for the moment, based in South Africa, at the University of Witwatersrand, and known as Reframing Africa. So this is an institution that we created, myself and some friends, including one from London, or 2 from the UK actually, John Akomfra, Pervez Khan, to really see how we could collectively set up the context for the emergence of an African discourse on the archive. As you know very well, even from an academic standpoint, when you want to study the archive, the first people that are thrown at you are Foucault, Derrida, and Africa is almost nowhere to be found in those debates, right? Yet, of course, Africa, as we know, is the archive of the world by definition. And of course, has invented some of the most intellectually challenging archival practices ever in the history of humanity. Of course, that is through ancient Egyptian culture. As you know, this culture of archiving is still mesmerizing the planet as we speak. And so with that heritage, with that legacy, it seemed incongruous that on the one hand, you have a continent that is the home of the archive in many ways, because it is the archive of the world by definition. And on the other, a paucity of discourse on it. And so part of the project of Reframing Africa is to bridge that gap. It doesn't mean, of course, eliminating everything else, but it means, of course, also adding the African accent to the question of the archive, and see how that accent would, in fact, potentially even transform the ways of imagining the archive. And so through the work, of course, of Reframing Africa, we receive, as part of the work, some of the colleagues from UCT who come and present their work and so on. And so when the fire took place, we reached out to UCT and manifested our availability to assist in any form or fashion, if we could, in helping reconstitute this archive. Now, remember, it was during the pandemic on the one hand. It was also there are also issues of, I mean, you don't also want to be the missionary, play the missionary savior complex. And so they have to set the terms about how they would like people to be involved in the process. And so So that's really where we left it. We are still obviously open to assisting not only in recovering, but also in developing, obviously, this outfit, which should be multiplied, by the way, across the other 54 African states. Right, so we need collections of African cinema in every single country, at the university level, at the public library level, at the elementary school level, at the high school level, etc., etc. And so that work obviously is something that we are interested in also pursuing in one form or fashion. And so that's that. But I mean, I guess your question also alludes to another issue, which is, of course, the fragility of African archives, obviously. There was a fire at UCT, but there was a flood at the Ouagadougou archive in 2009, for example. I don't know if you know that. And so a lot of the films were damaged. Some of them were transferred to Morocco because they have better facilities there and so on. And of course, the general context, sometimes the political context of Africa is actually an important challenge for the archive. First of all, new regime change often happens is often accompanied by a desire to destroy the archive of the prior regime. It happened to Nkrumah, it happened to Sankara, it happened to many of them. Regime change also, or other elements, of course. We know that the continent is now struggling with the question of jihadism, in particular the region where Burkina Faso is located, so Burkina, Mali, Niger, and of course, very soon the entire west coast of Africa, unfortunately. And so the question of the archive, the fragility of the archive, is something we have to actually start thinking about very seriously, because of course, many of these guys or these groups are iconophobes. Right. And so it means that, of course, one of the things that they probably might attack first and foremost might be the archive, the film archive, or the visual archive more broadly. And so it's something that we have to start thinking about very clearly now. Of course, hopefully they'll be defeated and that will be the end of the story. But the question of fragility is still something that we need to actually articulate specific policies and address in meaningful way. Yes.
Yeah. On that note, actually, Henry Sherry commented on the recent Financial Times article about Giovanni's show Raven Row, and he mentioned an agreement that FEPACI has made with the Kenyan government last month for an African audiovisual and cinema commission in Nairobi to preserve and restore films, to a fund for filmmaking and to support film schools. Can you speak a bit more about sort of, I guess, your work to build resilience and this agreement with the Kenyan government?
Yes, this is a long story. I try to make it brief. Before the Kenyan government actually got involved, as you know, FEPACI means the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers. Its mandate has always been to, first of all, to promote and defend the interests of African filmmakers and film community more generally. Second, to help set up meaningful, resilient, to use your terms, solid infrastructure for the production, distribution, exhibition of African cinema, both on the continent and beyond. Yeah. And so the question of preservation is one of the latest addition to this entire ecology of cinema that FEPACI has been concerned with. FEPACI, I should tell you, of course, is also, it's a continental body that represents African film. You have that political cachet, so to speak, which means that it is recognized by the African Union, observer status there. It's recognized by the European Union, you should know that. It's recognized by the Arab League, should know that. And it's also recognized by the UNESCO. And in all these places, it has a point of entry in order to really advocate for meaningful African cinema in one form or another. So because, and also much of the statutes are based, in fact, on those of the African Union. Yeah. And so many of the debates, for example, within African cinema were taken to the African Union by FEPACI. So many people don't know, for example, that the African Union has decreed October 12 as African Cinema Day, for example. So every year on October 12, one should be able to celebrate African cinema anywhere on the African continent, just like UNESCO has a audiovisual heritage day, etc. So we also have an African cinema. Now, so within the work, therefore, of FEPACI and in articulation with the African Union, given the Pan-African mandate of the FES, so there's always, therefore, a desire to have something within the continental body itself that would be devoted to really enabling cinema, African cinema, in many forms, in one form or another. And so that has been the subject of discussion for decades, but starting the mid-2000s, it was really accelerated, right? Whereby the desire to have an African cinema, audiovisual and cinema commission within the AU was promoted. So in different iteration with different supports for it and so on, different steps to it. And the acceleration really happened when the FEPACI Secretariat moved to Kenya in 2013. You know that FEPACI is headquartered in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, and its executive secretary for the longest time was also in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. But in the 2000s, filmmakers decided that it might be good to rotate the secretariat. So they decided to take it first to Johannesburg in South Africa. So it stayed there for about 67 years. And then in 2013, it went to Kenya. So as part of this agreement with Kenya, the idea was that the Kenyan government would support FEPACI while it was there. And of course, be an advocate for the project of FEPACI within, of course, the African Union as one of the members of the African Union. And so it's in that context that while we were there, a number of steps were taken to approach the African Union to push forward this idea of creating a commission. The African Union required that we produce a kind of study of sort of a state of the film industry in Africa. So we did, and so bringing people and stakeholders from different parts of the continent to really enact that. And so that finally in 2016, I think they actually officially, the ministers of culture of the 54 states decided that we should create this African Review Cinema Commission. The idea for the commission is simply to really look at the entire ecology of African cinema and promote it. Now, one of the most important elements of it, obviously, is the question of funding. As you know, one of the biggest problems of African cinema is and has always been the question of how to make films, period. There was a point where Usman Semben had to say in one meeting around the time of the centenary of cinema that, you know, we don't have money, but even there's the days of celluloid, even if we're going to scrape our skin to make films out of them, we would. Now, that's obviously a drastic image of the difficulties that African cinema is going through. And so hence the need for a Pan-African cinema fund. That's really one of our hopes with this commission, that something gets created that will allow African filmmakers to just get support from the continental body and make the film that they really want to make. We obviously know news to you that most of our films are made with support from various entities in Europe, in the US, in different places. And that, of course, depending on the strength of the filmmaker, one is oriented in one way or another. In fact, the political economy of cinema globally itself makes it so that it's hard to have one's idea at the beginning and have the same idea at the end of the process, because the workshops got involved. The fund, the cinema fund, that in Berlin, in Cannes, and by the time your film comes out, you actually don't recognize it because, as I said once, there are just too many cooks in the kitchen of African cinema. That's unfortunately the case, and so this fund will really, hopefully, intervene in that context, right? It would also, of course, I think, answer one of your questions, which was the question of filmmakers who are not making films. Think about it.
Yeah.
Med Hondo passed away with the dream of making a film called Toussaint Louverture. He spent at least, he started thinking about Toussaint Louverture in the 80s. Think about that. So the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and he passed away in 2019. So almost 40 years nourishing the dream of making this. He couldn't make it. Sam Maldoror passed away and leaving at least 15 to 20 screenplays that never, ever saw the light of day. Suleiman Sisi, one of the most brilliant filmmakers ever, has not been able to make a decent film worthy of his genius since 1995.
Yeah.
Abdurrahman Sissako made Timbuktu in 2013. We're talking a decade now. And I can go on and on and on and on, because of course the current mechanisms of in the broad world are primarily interested in first-time filmmakers, second-time filmmakers. But how about those who are at their sixth film and still have a lot to say? There's a sort of no man's land where many of our filmmakers find ourselves and are simply unable to really execute the ideas and the dreams of cinema that they carry day in and day out, and some end up in really impossible socio-economic conditions, if you will. So these are all the reasons why we put a lot of hope on this committee, in particular the fund that would come out of it, really, to help the African Union help African families. The European does for its own children. The Union does for its own children. And we could no doubt do the same within our continent ourselves. So that's really part of it. And so Kenya, therefore, because it sort of pushed the dossier forward at the African Union, we felt that, of course, it would be normal for the commission to be hosted there. It doesn't mean that it's a Kenyan institution. It will be like an international organization based in Kenya. Kenya will fund it, but the people who work in the commission would be from anywhere on the continent. No doubt. So that's really the idea. So we really are looking forward to what will come out of this in the years to come.
Yeah. I guess somewhat sort of as an extension of that kind of question of structures and structures that form and affect the way in which sort of African film is created and then I guess subsequently stored. I read an article that you did with Cecilia Cenciali for the Film Foundation in 2018, and also the wider UNESCO report on film in Africa. Both of these documents sort of reached the conclusion that sort of the best surviving elements for film elements for historic African films are to be found in European archives. Could you explain, I guess, why this is the case and sort of the conditions that underpin this phenomenon? And if sort of within that there are there's any sense of this as a restitution issue within European archives and with the relationships that you work through with FEPACI?
Well, first of all, cinema is almost like anything else as far as the relationship between Europe and Africa is concerned. It's the question of the colonial and neo-colonial division of labor. Cinema followed the same path. Just like raw materials are extracted and processed in Europe, just like agriculture is exported to Europe to be turned into finished products, just as I go on and on and on and on and on. Just like how cotton is exported and the clothes are sent back to us, etc., etc. Likewise for cinema. And so when African countries gained their independence, obviously the colonial apparatus did not leave much in terms of cinematic infrastructure on the continent, and definitely very little as far as post-production was concerned. And so the scenario was that these films, of course, would be funded in part by Europe. They would be shot in Africa, but the post-production would take place in Europe. It was a very smart strategy for Europeans because, of course, it meant keeping the film personnel employed for decades, generations to come. The labs, for example, the cinematographer, the editors, and so on, screenwriters, and so on and so forth. And so that's what, unfortunately, our filmmakers had to cope with if they wanted to make a film. It's that or no film. So if you take the case of one of the films that we restored, which was Dikonge Pipa's Munamoto, which we premiered at FESPACO in 2019. Dikonge Pipa is from Cameroon. But Dikonge Pipa made his film with a broken camera from the French Cultural Center in Douala in around 1974, 75. Right, so he shot the film with I don't know, I can't remember where he got the film stock, but he could not see the rushes of the film. Obvious. So look at the discipline that was demanded of African filmmaking. You could not see the rushes of your film for sometimes up to 6 months, 8 months, because once you finish it, you have to ship it to Europe. And then you have to have the money to go to Europe, pay for your hotel in Europe, sit through the editing process. And so when he arrived there, he realized that 1/3 of the film was no good. So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, you have to be imaginative and come up with a different narrative structure, editing structure, etc., which obviously gave the beautiful film that Munamoto is. But it raised at the same time the question of the colonial and neo-colonial division of labor, obviously. So the film would be processed there, and which meant that the negatives would stay there by definition. And when you're obviously interested in restoring a film, you're trying to look for as many elements of the film as possible, including the original camera negative, to get as close as possible to what the film looked like when it came. And so that now explains why, of course, we mentioned that, the African cinema archive is to a large extent a diaspora in many ways, because it's really dispersed across primarily the former colonizing countries. Think Britain, think France, think Germany, think Italy, I don't know, other places, etc., etc. So is it a question of restitution? It is in many ways, but in film, it's a bit complicated because, of course, film is not the same as a mask, for example, or a statue, etc., which are often built with material from within Africa itself. Film is an industrial art, which means that the industrial infrastructure, again, has partaking of the colonial law. It was primarily in Europe, right? And Africa was never properly industrialized for very good reason, because they had to be kept dependent on Europe. And so that means, therefore, that our films had to stay there. And we can ask, so, one could make an argument, a restitution argument, a reparation argument, precisely only on the basis of the unfair terms of the relationships between Africa and Europe. Because, of course, if this term had been fair, Africa would have been industrialized by now. We wouldn't need to keep our film there. They would be in optimal conditions on our continent, with us having developed ways of in spite of our difficult climate, etc., of keeping them, and so on and so forth. So yes. But currently, of course, it's difficult, let's say, let's go and take all the negative African film and bring them to Africa. Where are we going to put them? If you go to many African archives, at 10 meters before you enter the archive, you can smell vinegar. Right? So you have to choose. You know, okay, are you gonna put it in vinaigrette just for the sake of it, or will you really try to keep it for now in the conditions where they are, and until such time when, of course, we have created the optimal conditions to repatriate them. For example, I think Timothy Basori, who was the head of Ivorian cinema for many years. We restored one of his films called La Femme au Couteau, Woman with a Knife. When he tells you his story, he says essentially that at some point, Ivorian Society for Cinema went to Gaumont in Paris, recuperated the negatives of the newsreels and brought them back to Abidjan. If you go to Abidjan today, there's zero trace of any of these newsreels, right? So we can't also commit crimes against cinema when we don't have, in fact, the optimal condition to preserve celluloid so it's a challenge. It's a challenge, something that we are really thinking about very seriously. That's why we have things like Reframing Africa, but more than Reframing Africa, I mean, we're thinking about really developing some research and development type of wing, if you will, where we would be having exchanges with I think there's something called the Image Permanence Institute or something like that, which really studied some of these questions of climate control, etc., issues of solar energy, because of course in Africa the question of energy is crucial. We have as they call it, they say in South Africa, we have load shedding everywhere on the continent, including South Africa, the richest country supposedly on the continent. As you know, recently was declared energy was declared a national emergency or something to that effect, and without that, preservation is a challenge. So develop therefore other means to really optimally keep these films at home in Africa, and of course make it possible for our filmmakers not to have to travel thousands of kilometers to access these films, create archival outfits across the continent, etc. These are all part of the big picture here.
Yeah. I guess sort of on that, you're part of the founding of the African Film Heritage Project, and you have the 50 film target with sort of the Film Foundation for FEPACI and UNESCO. I understand 15 titles have now been completed from the UNESCO Cannes conference. Can you give us a bit of a preview of what's coming up as far as the African Film Heritage Project is concerned? And can you discuss the process of researching these films and how you sort of identify titles and then discover where the material might be held?
Well, we tend not to announce too much ahead of time, title, just because the process is complicated. You see, we may want to work on it. We may actually want to work on a title, but for whatever reason, the lab where it is or the distributor who holds the film doesn't want to collaborate. So there's a lot of, behind the scene archival diplomatics involved. So you can say, okay, next year we're doing this, because if you don't do it, people will come and hold you to it, you see. And so that's really, sometimes we have, let's say, opposing entity who actually want to sabotage our project. That also exists. I should tell you that. You need to know that. You need to know that. And so for all these reasons, we tend not to announce. But when obviously we are absolutely certain that the work will proceed, etc., we make an announcement. For example, last 2 weeks ago at FESPACO, we did the world premiere of the restored version of Idrissa Ouedraogo's first feature film called Yam Dabo, The Choice, for example. It's a 1987 film, brilliant film, that really has many of the ethos and the values of the Sankara Revolution, for example, from 1983 to 1987. and that may even have inspired, that's my argument, one sequence of a film by Semben. Semben made a film a decade later called Gelowar. Not a decade, maybe 5 years later, called Gelowar. But in a way, you can see some conversation between the two of them, really, in that vein. So we are working. All you should know is that we are working toward the 50, and the 50 are really primarily an initial list. We might go beyond, obviously. And so right now, we are working on also diversifying the kind of films that we are restoring. So far, it's been primarily fiction films. And so we want to emphasize also the documentary. We also want to emphasize the newsreel, because in fact, most of the African countries had beautiful newsreel traditions across, some of which were was produced not only in Western Europe, but also, don't forget, we have Eastern Europe. So places like former Yugoslavia, for example, where the newsreels of Mali were post-produced, where they had some in Bamana and in French, so that the music could be circulated across the country and reach the masses, etc., etc. So we're working on that as well. We're working also on diversifying the geographic range of the films. It's as you know, it's a Pan-African. So let's say the ideological a priori of the project is the Pan-African project. The pi in FEPACI means Pan-African. Pan-African. We fully subscribe to the ideology of Pan-African without any hesitation. And so the question, therefore, of the selection of the film means that we are committed to selecting films from the 5 traditional regions of continental Africa. So North Africa, East, West, Central, and Southern Africa. But as you know, the African Union has declared that Africa has a 6th region. Do you know which one that is?
No,
no. Well, I'll tell you right now. But the 6th region is the diaspora. And so we add also the diaspora. For example, we restored a film by Raoul Peck called Lumumba, The Death of a Prophet, and more will be coming up. And so the Pan-African ideology is at the core of, let's say, the criteria, the selection criteria of our film. Of course, some are auteur films, it's obvious. So we have many fantastic auteurs in the tradition of African cinema. You know them by now. But I can tell you one of our obvious one of the effects, I would say, I think, effects. Obviously, Med Hondo has always been an extremely talented filmmaker and so on and so forth. But one could argue that there was sort of, in terms of his worldwide recognition, increase after the restoration of Soleipo. I think it's hard to say the contrary, really. And if you watch, since you're at the British Film Institute right now, so this is the British Film Institute related event, well, you know that the BFI does this every decade survey of the 10 best films. And so, well, look at the past polls and look at this year's poll. If you look at this year's poll, Med Hondo is all over the place. Semben is all over the place. Mambeti is all over the place. Well, all these films have been restored in recent years, as you know, and therefore this has allowed for the further circulation, and therefore it's not really the question of the recognition. I'm thinking more about the contribution to actually rewriting even the history of cinema and what counts as cinema. So for a long time, these films were marginalized. Not that they become better because they were restored. They were always better. But the world just didn't have the language and vocabulary to recognize them as such. And I think that this process helps provide the language and vocabulary and lenses through which they could obviously recognize. So,
yeah, I guess kind of on that, yes, expanding access more widely. One of the earlier meetings I had when I was putting together this project was with the film programmer Jonathan Ali, and he mentioned this to me and also on Twitter at a later point, and also
Who is
Dr.
that? I didn't hear that. You met
Jonathan Ali. He's a film programmer, also based in the UK, but from Trinidad. And then someone who worked on the project, Dr. Lennon Mahishi, who works with the Pitt Rivers Museum. They both talked about sort of the importance of how, and to quote Jonathan directly, is we can't talk about restitution of global South cinema if the films in question don't return to the spaces from which they emerge. The circulation of these films, mostly or only in the global North, can only ever be part of the story. And similarly, Dr. Mahishi says, if we have historical film and sound archives out of which more film and sound work is produced, which remain inaccessible to the communities made subjects of this conversation, then what is being restituted? So on that, I guess kind of, I was going to ask, what are the possible avenues that you see coming forward from your sort of work on the African Film Heritage Project, and are there sort of future possibilities for, what are the future possibilities for distribution in Africa that you see as being viable?
This is the alpha and omega of this project for me. First of all, of course, the desire was always to have these films circulate in Africa because of they're part of the cinematic heritage of. So all Africans, every single one of the 1 billion, 1 point, I don't know how many billion that this continent now has, is a potential, I wouldn't say target, but a desirable audience for this project. It's obvious to us. Now, you know that one of the key issues of African cinema has always been the question of distribution. You also know very well that part of the marginalization of African cinema and of other national cinemas or continental cinema has always been, of course, the result of this particular quote from Taha Sharia, which you also heard from in Ferid's film here, in Shalouf's film, which is that those who control distribution control the cinema, right? Those who control distribution control the cinema. That means that the infrastructure for distribution has for the longest time been controlled by the hegemons of cinema. You know them, they were celebrating themselves 2 nights ago, so you know exactly who it is, right? Now, so that by definition creates obstacles for the circulation of art. Also, of course, we never had a strong, within the continent, a strong domestic distribution process. We just never had it. We just never had it. Add to that, of course, we are still reeling from the effects of the structural adjustment program that forced our governments to divest themselves from culture, from cinema, and many national distribution companies were privatized or just sold off. Right? So which means theaters were turned into churches and mosques and supermarkets, etc., etc. In Ouagadougou, if you go, you will see today one of the most beautiful theater that Ferid is mentioning in his quote today are, market stands, right? So all this has really created difficulties in terms of the circulation. But things we basically have a multi-pronged approach to this. We want this film to have a theatrical life. So one of the things that, for example, we'll try to do, let's say in Burkina alone, so we had a whole section, you may know this because these are sort of digressions, but you need to understand how they function. We now have a section of FESPACO called FESPACO Classics, which is entirely devoted to celebrating the heritage and patrimony of African cinema. So this is I would say, a direct result of the work that we've been doing for the past 5 or 6 years. Clear, no doubt about it. I wrote the terms of reference for this section. On the one hand, I'm now the artistic director of the section. So we showed a number of films as part of that, including Idrissa Ouedraogo's film that I was mentioning, including the restored version of Sarawunia that Harvard Film Archive did, including the restored version of films like La Vie est Belle, which were done by the Institut Français, including, for example, our own focus on the centenary of Sembène during the festival, which involves showing Mandabi, which was also recently restored by a French studio, I think Orange Studio, or Studio Canal, I think it was, etc., etc. Right? So just the audience that came to this theater, it's clear to us that there's room, there's a desire for these films within African audience. It's clear. So one of the things that we'll do in the next few months would be to negotiate with the owners of the theaters in Ouaga, two of the theaters in Ouaga, and okay, can we have a programming around the films of the African Film Heritage Project? Let's say once a month, you show for a week, I don't know, and let's see what we get, right? That's in Ouaga, but of course we can multiply that across African cities, countries. That's one approach. Increasingly, Africans are getting involved into streaming platforms. And so we will also, we're approached already by one or two to that effect. So we have to develop that axis as well. And when I mentioned earlier that it was the alpha and omega for us, is because one of the things that we really want to cultivate in the process is the birth, if not the birth, at least the consolidation of distribution of the exhibition practices articulated around patrimony and the archive across the African continent. So we want bold distributors to come and take this film and say, okay, I can show this film in Nairobi, show it to 10 million people. Here's what I'm going to do. Tack, 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 tack. And we can work with them to make the film available, etc., etc. So that's part of the project. Another element of the project is, of course, the educational aspects of this. If you think of some like Sarawunia or Kade Charoy or I don't know, Sambizanga even and others, but this could fit very perfectly in history lessons about the history of Africa. So imagine all the school children of the continent watching Sambizanga, watching Kade Charoy, watching Sarawunia and many, many, many other films. Imagine university program watching all of African cinema under very themes of women's condition, issues of gender, issues of patriarchy. I mean, the possibilities are limitless, very, to put it mildly. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about, and if we get the right support to implement it, I think it will be not only fantastic, but one of the things that we're hoping to do, certainly within the African continent, is through cinema and of course other means, but cinema is what we have, so we'll emphasize our own chapel here, to create common references, cultural references, cinematic references for the 1 billion strong continent, so that we have in common a number of images, a number of symbolisms, a number of semiotic approaches to things, a circulation of them across, so that we can, sort of a film from Tunisia could be seen in Uganda, from Uganda, seen in Senegal, from Senegal, seen in Congo, etc., etc. So we really, through cinema, produce very literally Pan-African subjectivity and consciousness.
Yeah, completely understand. It's yeah. I thank you. Thank you for this whole discussion. It's been eye-opening, and actually the possibilities raised from yeah, the progression of the project are incredible. Yeah, I'd also like to thank you after joining us after your very busy schedule. So yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank
Thanks for
everyone for
having me. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to see young people like you who are taking on this question very seriously, want to find out more. Hopefully I'll be coming to the UK before not too long, hopefully in June, July, something like that.
Yeah.
And of course, part of the just meet you, of course, but also to see what kinds of discussion we could have with the BFI itself around sort of the UK axis, so to speak, of this project. So that's also something that we could think about.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this talk in conversation with Dr. Sanogo. There's a week left of the program, so if you'd like to check out any of the films available and any of the discussions and presentations that are available, please do. Thank you.